In the last few lectures, we've examined these vast and rapid changes taking place in the United States in the 35 years following the Civil War. So by the time we get to the end of the 1800s, the U.S. is now an industrial superpower on the world stage. This is something that was not the case in the years leading up to or even during the Civil War. We've seen a transportation revolution that has aided the expansion of the U.S. out to its western coast. And we've seen a complete overhaul of the economy as there's been both an agricultural revolution and an industrial revolution, so that we see more and more output coming from each farm and a real shift from the small independent farm to these larger bonanza farms that are producing massive amounts of crops for the domestic and global market. But we've seen also now this industrial economy that has shifted to wage labor positions, largely unskilled wage labor positions. And so we see people actually leaving rural areas and poverty-stricken agricultural areas in pursuit of wage labor positions in northern and eastern and midwestern cities. With all of this, we see a growth in class distinction. There's been a huge growth in the disparity of wealth between the richest Americans and the poorest Americans. We've seen that exemplified by these corporate giants, these captains of industry or robber barons, if you will, like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, and their wage labor workers. And this has caused wage laborers to organize, to petition for better working conditions and better wages. And so we see this clash between labor organization and these corporate giants, these corporations and their trusts. And we also see the federal government often siding with the corporations during these times. We've also continued to see strife between racial and ethnic groups. And so even though the immediate years after the Civil War give us civil rights legislation and Reconstruction amendments that expand the meaning and boundaries of freedom in the United States to include Black Americans and other non-whites, we see resistance against this new expanded definition of freedom by whites who don't want to include Blacks and other non-whites into American society and American politics. And so, especially in the South, we see really these new rights and freedoms rescinded in ways through racist laws at the state and local level, Jim Crow laws, and through segregation. And so all of these things are happening in the late 1800s. And in this lecture, we're going to look at really the culmination of those things. And we're going to see how certain groups are going to continue to push for inclusion in the definition and within the boundaries of freedom. And we're going to see people pushing for better economic opportunity. And we're going to see people calling for political reform. And all of these things are happening here in the United States at home. And it really picked up steam with the populist movement. And we're going to see it really start to influence the development of the progressive movement and the progressive era that will emerge in the beginning of the 20th century. Now, that's all bubbling up and taking place here at home. But we're also going to see that in the last decade or so of the 19th century, the United States gets an opportunity to flex its military muscle on the world stage as well. By this time, it was already an industrial and economic power on the world stage, but in the Spanish-American War, the U.S. begins to expand its own empire. And the defeat of Spain swiftly in the late 1800s gives the United States control of new territories abroad, outside of the continental U.S. So we're going to be taking a look at the struggle over the meaning and boundaries of freedom that was taking place at the grassroots level here in America, here at home, by Americans, but also how the United States as a larger entity, or at least the federal government of the United States, was seeking to define the meanings and boundaries of freedom abroad, and what America's role would be in promoting that freedom or those liberties for the rest of the world, and to people other than American citizens. So here's a preview of what we'll be covering in this lecture. These are the subtopics that you can use to structure your notes. We'll be covering the populist challenge, the segregated South, redrawing the boundaries, and becoming a world power. And of course, as always, we'll start each subtopic with its own focus question. And the purpose of the focus question, again, is just to point your notes toward a theme so that you can make better sense of them. And so the focus question for the first subtopic, or the populist challenge, is what were the origins and the significance of populism? Like workers, farmers in the South and West faced growing economic insecurity as agricultural prices fell and economic dependency on merchants and banks increased. Sharecropping kept millions of black and white Southern farmers in poverty, and an oversupply of world cotton led to dramatic price decreases that threatened Southern farmers' livelihoods and property. These farmers soon blamed their woes on railroads' high freight rates, high interest rate loans from bankers and merchants, and the fiscal policies of the federal government that reduced the money supply and farm prices. In response, farmers organized the Farmers Alliance in Texas in the late 1870s, which quickly spread to dozens of states. The alliance at first strayed away from politics and established cooperatives called exchanges to finance and market crops. But when banks refused to loan money for the exchanges, the alliance proposed the sub-treasury plan, in which the federal government would establish warehouses where farmers could store their crops until sold, and by using the crops as collateral, the government would issue loans directly to farmers at low interest rates, thus ending their dependence on bankers and merchants for credit. Demands for the sub-treasury led the alliance to politics. In the early 1890s, the alliance formed the People's Party, called Populists, the era's greatest political insurgency. The Populists appealed not just to farmers, but to all producers, including miners, industrial workers, and small businessmen. But most of its supporters were cotton and wheat farmers in the South and in the West. The Populists organized massive educational campaigns using pamphlets, newspapers, and revival-style mass meetings throughout the country. This was the last expression of the 19th century idea that America was a commonwealth of small producers whose freedom rested on individual ownership of productive property and the dignity of labor. But the Populists were forward-looking, embracing scientific methods of agriculture and modern technologies that made large-scale cooperatives possible, such as the railroad, telegraph, and national market, and they wanted the federal government to regulate them for the public interest, a very 20th century idea. Further, the Populists believed the government could move beyond partisan conflict to promote the public good, a vision soon to be adopted by the progressive movement and later politicians including Jimmy Carter and more recently Barack Obama. The Populists adopted a famous platform at their 1892 Omaha Convention. It proposed many measures to restore democracy and economic opportunity for ordinary Americans, some of which came to pass in the next century, such as direct election of U.S. senators, government control of currency, a graduated income tax, low-cost public financing for farmers, and workers' rights to organize unions. The platform also called for national ownership of railroads to allow farmers to inexpensively get their crops to market. In some parts of the South, the Populists even heroically tried to unite black and white farmers on a common political and economic program, but the barriers were just too great. Racism, the legacy of the Civil War, and the fact that many white populists were landowning farmers while black farmers were tenants and agricultural laborers facing a different set of problems, all militated against such an alliance. Black farmers organized their own Cotton Farmers Alliance, whose strikes were suppressed by white authorities, some of whom were even sympathetic to white populists. While white populists were hardly anti-racist, some did recognize that whites would have to appeal to blacks in order to break the Democratic Party's hold on the South and its opposition to reform, and in a few places, like North Carolina, white and black populists together won state elections. In most of the South, however, Democrats defeated the populists by mobilizing whites to vote against the idea of Negro supremacy, intimidating blacks, or rigging elections. The populists also engaged the reform efforts of farmers and middle-class women and endorsed woman suffrage in many states. In 1892, the populist candidate for president, James Weaver, won more than 1 million votes, and the party carried 5 western states and elected 3 governors and 15 members of Congress. When a severe depression in 1893 intensified conflict between labor and capital, it seemed that the populists might gain the votes of industrial workers, who had traditionally supported the two major parties. Employers used state or federal authority to protect their economic power and suppress labor unrest. In May 1894, the federal government dispersed Coxey's army, a march of the unemployed led by Jacob Coxey, an Ohio businessman, that converged on the nation's capital. Okay, here's an extra credit opportunity for anyone who's interested, just as a thank you for going the extra mile and making it this far into the lecture. This is a chance to earn 5 extra credit points. I'm going to give you a website to visit. It has a short article. You just review that article and then send me an email with the answers to these questions, and I'll give you 5 points extra credit. The questions are, what famous book, which later became a very famous movie, do some historians believe that Coxey's Army's March on Washington inspired? And what people groups do each of the main characters from the book or the movie represent? Okay, what people groups do each of these main characters represent? All right. Okay, so that's what you'll email me. Here's where you go to find it. In your browser or in your search engine, type in OER, the letters. It stands for Open Educational Resource. So OER. Then give yourself a space, type Commons, Commons, another space, Baum, Baum, another space, Coxey, Coxey. So as you look at your search engine or your browser, it should read OER, Commons, Baum, Coxey. When you hit enter, it should pull up an oercommons.org site that has a title of L. Frank Baum. Did Coxey's Army inspire? And then says some other things, which I won't say here. Go to that article at that website and then review that article and get your answers. So you can tell me what the book or movie was that some historians believe Coxey's Army's March on Washington inspired, and what each of the main characters from that story represent. Okay, so that's a way to earn 5 extra credit points if you're interested. Now, also in 1894, workers in the company-owned town of Pullman, Illinois, called a strike to protest a reduction in wages. The American Railway Union, with 150,000 members, announced they would not handle Pullman cars. The boycott crippled national rail service, and through President Grover Cleveland, an injunction was obtained that ordered the strikers back to work. The strike collapsed after the union's leaders, including Eugene Debs, were jailed. The Supreme Court later confirmed their sentences and approved the use of injunctions against striking labor unions. In 1894, the Populists doubled their efforts to appeal to industrial workers, and in state and congressional elections that year, with the Depression worsening, voters abandoned the Democrats. The Populist vote in rural areas increased, but most workers did not vote Populist. Few populist demands actually spoke to workers' needs, as their calls for higher agricultural prices would raise food costs for workers and diminish the value of their wages, and the movement's Protestant and revivalist culture alienated Catholic and immigrant workers. Urban workers instead voted for the Republicans, who argued that higher tariff rates would revive the economy by protecting American manufacturing and workers from imports and cheap foreign labor. The Republicans gained a massive 117 seats in the House. In 1896, the Democrats and Populists united behind William Jennings Bryan, a young congressman from Nebraska. Bryan had won the Democratic nomination in a speech that captured the fears and hopes of farmers. Bryan called for the free coinage of silver, the unrestricted minting of silver money, and he used biblical imagery to condemn the gold standard in perhaps the most famous lines of political oratory in American history. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. Bryan's demand for free silver was the latest expression of a long-standing view that increasing the amount of currency in circulation would raise the prices of farmers' crops and make it easier for them to pay their debts. This was an inflationary tactic. That's what populists wanted and farmers wanted. They wanted more money available in the economy. So they wanted the federal government to either flood the economy with more paper money or put more silver money out on the market and get away from this strict gold standard that kept currency to a minimum. In doing that, they would devalue the dollar, because whether it's money or it's agricultural products or industrial products, it's a supply and demand curve, right? So if you have more supply, then it's going to lower the value of each individual unit. So they wanted more money available, which would lower the value of the dollar, so farmers could then charge more for their agricultural product. So instead of selling this bushel of corn for $4, you could now sell it for $8 because the dollar was worth less and there was more dollars out on the open market. So now you get $8 in return. Even though that's a devalued dollar, you're getting 8 of them instead of 4. And if your debt to this merchant or this bank is $20, well, now you've got $8 to help pay toward that debt instead of just 4. Okay, and multiply that by the number of bushels that you're selling or whatever. So that's the idea behind inflationary tactics like the free and unlimited minting or coinage of silver. So Bryan's nomination represented a shift in Democratic leadership away from elites. But Bryan's appeal was highly religious and revivalist and influenced by the social gospel. Republicans, on the other hand, argued that gold was the only honest currency, and that abandoning it would prevent economic recovery by scaring creditors away from making loans. They nominated Governor William McKinley of Ohio, who had shepherded to the highly protectionist McKinley Tariff in Congress in 1890. The 1896 election was the first modern presidential election. The Republicans poured an unprecedented amount of money into a highly organized campaign that used a massive educational effort directed against the Democrats' calls for free silver. The results showed a nation divided along regional lines. McKinley won the election with the votes of industrial states in the Northeast and Midwest. Labor conflict did not produce political results. Party politics seemed to mute class conflict, not reinforce it. Industrial America, from workers to industrialists, voted solidly Republican and continued to do so for years. McKinley's victory shattered the political stalemate of the previous 20 years. It launched a period of Republican dominance that would last until the 1930s, and it marked a pinnacle in voter participation, which ever since has been in decline. Today, only around half of the electorate actually casts ballots. All right, next let's take a look at the segregated South. And the focus question here is, how did the liberties of blacks after 1877 give way to legal segregation across the South? Populism's defeat in the South allowed for the imposition of a new racial order. The Redeemers, a coalition of merchants, planters, and businessmen who ruled the region after 1877 and claimed to have, quote, redeemed the South from the corruption and horrors of, quote, black rule, worked to reverse Reconstruction's achievements. They reduced taxes and public spending and cut back public schools, which especially hurt blacks. New laws allowed the arrest of those without employment and increased punishment for petty crimes. As the South's prison population rose, convicts, mostly poor blacks, were rented out to railroads, miners, and lumber companies as cheap involuntary labor at a high profit. Labor unions in the South, most notably the Knights of Labor, assailed the convict labor system, which rented out prisoners, a majority black and in jail for petty crimes, to private businessmen. In the 1880s, Atlanta editor Henry Grady relentlessly promoted the dream of a new South, in which industrialization and agricultural diversification would deliver prosperity to the region. While planters, merchants, and industrialists prospered, the region as a whole became more impoverished. While mining and textiles developed in some areas, the region's low wages and taxes and convict labor did not spur much economic development. By 1900, except for the major iron and steel city of Birmingham, Alabama, southern cities had little industry and mostly exported cotton, tobacco, and rice. The South as a whole stayed dependent on the North for capital and manufactured goods. As late as the 1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would declare the South the nation's primary economic problem. Black farmers, the most disadvantaged rural Southerners, suffered the most from the region's economic condition. In the Upper South, mines, iron mills, and tobacco factories offered some jobs to black workers, and some black farmers owned land. In the rice kingdom of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, the plantations went to ruin, and many blacks acquired land and became self-sufficient farmers. In most of the Deep South, however, blacks owned a smaller percentage of land in 1900 than they had in the late 1870s. In southern cities, institutions such as schools, churches, businesses, and clubs created by blacks during Reconstruction formed the basis of dynamic black urban communities. But the labor market was racially divided, and black men were excluded from skilled and professional occupations, while black women were limited to wage work as domestic servants and were excluded from occupations open to white women. Blacks trapped at the bottom of an economically stagnant South migrated by the tens of thousands. In 1879 and 1880, nearly 60,000 African Americans moved to Kansas, seeking political rights, safety, education, and economic opportunity. Its participants called the move the Exodus, named after the biblical account of the Jews' flight from slavery in Egypt. But despite worsening conditions, most blacks had no choice but to stay in the South. While economic expansion took place in northern cities, most employers there offered jobs only to white migrants from rural areas and European immigrants, not blacks. Only in World War I did jobs open up for blacks, helping to spur a massive movement northward called the Great Migration. Despite redemption, blacks continued to hold office and vote in the South after 1877. Even while Democrats restructured Southern politics to limit blacks' political power and representation, blacks continued to hold office in states and Congress. But black political opportunities diminished in this period. Talented and ambitious black men increasingly avoided politics and entered business, law, or the church. Black women became political leaders, and respectable middle-class black women pressed for women's rights and racial progress through organizations like the National Association of Colored Women, formed in 1896. In some states, however, blacks continued to vote and Republicans stayed competitive with Democrats. Other states like Tennessee and Arkansas witnessed a biracial populist coalition. But eventually, the threat of a biracial insurgency contributed to Democratic successes and the push to disenfranchise African Americans. Between 1890 and 1906, every Southern state enacted laws or constitutional provisions intended to eliminate the black vote. Because the 15th Amendment prohibited the use of race as a qualification for the suffrage, Southern lawmakers designed laws that seemed colorblind, but were meant to keep blacks from voting. Most popular were the poll tax, or a fee citizens must pay in order to be eligible to vote, literacy tests, in which if you can't read or write, then you can't vote, and a requirement that a voter show an understanding of the state constitution. Although some white leaders presented disenfranchisement as a good government measure that would end fraud and violence in elections, it was a means for ending black participation in politics, and it worked. By 1940, only 3% of adult blacks in the South were registered to vote. Poor and illiterate whites were also disenfranchised by these laws. Disenfranchisement led to a generation of Southern demagogue politicians who mobilized white voters by appealing to their racism, and disenfranchisement could not have occurred without Northern approval. In 1891, the Senate defeated a proposal to protect black voting rights in the South, and the Supreme Court approved disenfranchisement laws. According to the 14th Amendment, any state that deprived its male citizens of the franchise was supposed to lose part of its representation in Congress, but this was not held to apply to blacks. Thus, Southern congressmen had far greater power than their small electorates warranted. Alongside disenfranchisement in the 1890s, segregation was imposed throughout the South. Laws and local customs that required separating the races had existed in the North before the Civil War, and during Reconstruction, Southern schools and other institutions had been segregated. In the 1880s, though, race relations in the South were fluid, with some railroads, theaters, and hotels admitting blacks and whites, while others discriminated. In 1883, the Supreme Court invalidated the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which had outlawed racial discrimination by hotels and other public facilities, and held that the 14th Amendment banned unequal treatment by state authorities, not private business. In the landmark 1896 ruling of Plessy v. Ferguson, the court approved state laws requiring separate facilities for blacks and whites, arguing that segregated facilities did not discriminate as long as they were separate but equal. States then responded to Plessy by passing laws requiring segregation in every part of Southern life, in schools, hospitals, toilets, and cemeteries. Despite the doctrine of separate but equal, facilities for blacks were either inferior or non-existent. Segregation was an important part of a system of white supremacy in the South, in which each part, such as disenfranchisement, economic inequality, and inferior education, reinforced the others. Segregation did not so much keep races apart as ensure that whites would have the advantage wherever they did meet. A racial social etiquette developed in which blacks had to give way to whites on sidewalks and could not raise their voices at whites or otherwise be assertive. Segregation also affected other groups, including Chinese laborers in Mississippi and Mexican Americans in Texas. Blacks who challenged white supremacy or refused to accept the indignities of segregation faced political and legal power and immediate violent reprisal. In each year between 1883 and 1905, more than 50 persons, most of them black, were lynched or killed by a mob in the South. Lynching continued well into the 20th century. Some were secret, but others were public and promoted by organizers and the media. Lynchings often resulted in atrocities against the victims, and law enforcement rarely prevented lynching or punished lynchers. Many victims were accused of having raped or assaulted white women, an allegation often without basis. But many white Southerners considered preserving white womanhood a sufficient basis for extrajudicial murder. Lynching is virtually unknown as a phenomenon anywhere else in the world. The reconciliation of the North and South in the 1880s and 1890s came at the cost of widespread hopes for racial equality that had existed during and after the Civil War. In popular literature and at veterans' reunions, the war came to be remembered as a tragic quarrel between brothers, in which blacks had played no role, and which had been caused by clashes over states' rights and the preservation of the Union, not slavery. Reconstruction came to be universally seen as a period of black misrule imposed on the South by the North, a view that legitimized disenfranchisement and segregation in the South. Southern governments and schools celebrated the, quote, lost cause of the Confederacy and condemned the evils of Reconstruction. Even as Northern Protestants abandoned the concern for racial justice and turned to sectional reconciliation, Southern churches played a role in keeping the idea of the Old South alive by refusing to reunite with Northern branches. Nationwide, textbooks emphasized images of happy slaves, and black troops fighting in the Civil War were all but forgotten, and at times when black veterans sought to participate in memorials, they were met with violence from whites. Okay, next let's look at the subtopic, redrawing the boundaries. And the focus question here is, in what ways did the boundaries of American freedom grow narrower in this period? The effective nullification of Reconstruction-era laws and amendments and the making of blacks into second-class citizens reflected trends across the nation. America seemed to be fracturing along racial and class lines in the late 19th century. One observer noted that the result was a far-reaching obsession with redrawing the boundary of freedom by identifying and excluding those unworthy of freedom's blessings. Many Americans seemed to adopt a more exclusive definition of nationhood and national identity. Immigrants were increasingly seen as a threat to American sense of identity and traditions. This was largely due to a change in the sources of immigration to the United States. Despite prolonged depression, 3.5 million immigrants came to the United States in the 1890s looking for industrial work in the Northeast and Midwest. They came not from Ireland, England, Germany, or Scandinavia, as had earlier European immigrants, but from nations in Southern and Eastern Europe, particularly Italy and the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires. These new immigrants were seen as members of distinct races whose lower level of civilization was held to explain their acceptance of low-paying jobs and their innate criminality. The Immigration Restriction League, founded in Boston in 1894, called for reducing immigration by barring illiterates from entering the country. This measure was adopted by Congress in 1897, but vetoed by President Cleveland, though most states adopted the secret ballot as a means of disenfranchising immigrants, many of whom did not read English and thus had had their ballots cast by party workers. States stopped allowing immigrants to vote before they had become citizens and imposed new residency and literacy requirements. Along with black disenfranchisement in the South, suffrage seemed more and more a privilege, not a right. Although single Chinese men had been welcomed as cheap contract labor in the West, when Chinese families started to migrate in the 1870s, Congress barred women from migrating in 1875. In 1882, Congress temporarily excluded all Chinese immigrants from entering the country. This was the first time that race had been used to exclude an entire group of people from entering the United States, and it was made permanent in 1902. At the time of the exclusion, more than 100,000 people of Chinese descent lived in America, mostly on the West Coast, and they suffered intense discrimination and occasional mob violence. States like California discriminated against the Chinese in education and other areas. Through the legal challenges and lawsuits brought before various courts, Chinese immigrants helped define the reach of the 14th Amendment. While the Supreme Court upheld the citizenship of children born to Chinese immigrants on American soil, the court also affirmed the right of Congress to erect racial restrictions on immigration. Chinese exclusion long affected Chinese immigrants who were perceived to be incapable of assimilation. Social movements that helped to expand 19th century boundaries of freedom now revised their goals so they could be achieved in the new economic and intellectual environment. Some black leaders, for example, started to emphasize self-help and individual self-advancement into middle-class America as an alternative to politics. Booker T. Washington symbolized this change in black life. In 1895, Washington delivered a speech called The Atlanta Compromise at the Atlanta Cotton Exposition, urging blacks to accommodate segregation and cease agitation for civil and political rights. He founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a center for vocational training or education for jobs as opposed to broad liberal arts, as he believed obtaining farms and skilled work was more important than full citizenship for blacks. He told a white audience in Atlanta, quote, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress." End quote. Whites who wanted a docile labor force that would not form unions and work cheaply embraced his vision, while many blacks supported him from a belief that direct assaults on white power were failures and that blacks should build up their own communities. The dissolution of the Knights of Labor and the rise of the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, in the 1890s signaled in the labor movement a similar move away from broad reforms to more limited aims. Strikes like the Pullman strike seemed to show that direct confrontations with capital devastated workers' organizations. Unions, declared Samuel Gompers, the AFL's founder and longtime president, should avoid seeking economic independence, politics, or the utopian goals of groups like the Knights. Gompers and the AFL thought unions should simply bargain with employers for higher wages and better working conditions. Like Booker T. Washington, Gompers used the language of the era's business culture. His strategy was known as business unionism. He embraced the idea of freedom of contract and turned it into an argument against the interference of judges with workers' rights to organize unions. In the 1890s, union membership recovered from its decline in the late 1880s. But the AFL unions that grew abandoned the Knights' ideal of labor solidarity and restricted its membership to skilled workers, a small minority of workers which effectively excluded most unskilled workers who were mostly blacks, women, and new European immigrants. The AFL became strong in trades with highly skilled workers, like printing and construction, but was weak or non-existent in basic industries like steel or the factories that dominated the economy. Changes in the women's movement reflected the same expansion of activity and narrowing boundaries. The 1890s began what would be called the Women's Era, 3 decades in which women, though still denied the vote, had greater opportunities for economic independence and a role in public life. Nearly 5 million women worked for wages by 1900, and though most were young, unmarried, and worked in traditional women's jobs such as domestic service and garments, a new generation of college-educated women were taking better-paid white-collar jobs. Women also had more influence in politics and society through a number of new organizations, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1874, which moved from demanding prohibition laws to demanding comprehensive economic and political reform, including the vote. Yet feminism in this period moved away from demanding equal rights to claims more in line with dominant racial and ethnic norms. While feminism of equal rights was never fully repudiated, the mostly native-born white and middle-class women who dominated the suffrage movement laid claim to the vote as members of a superior race and complained that unworthy non-whites, such as immigrants, had the vote, while white women did not. Okay, next let's look at the section titled Becoming a World Power. And the focus question here is, how did the United States emerge as an imperial power in the 1890s? America's narrow definition of nationhood was projected abroad in the late 1890s as the United States became an imperial power in the world. The last quarter of the 19th century is known as the Age of Imperialism, when rival European empires divided large parts of the world among themselves. In this period, the United States was considered a second-rate power and not included in imperial competition and diplomacy. Although large land-based empires such as the Russian, Ottoman, and Chinese empires, and overseas empires such as the British, French, and Spanish dominated much of the 19th century, after 1870 a new imperialism emerged, dominated by European powers and Japan. Belgium, Great Britain, and France consolidated their colonies in Africa, and Germany acquired colonies on that continent. The British and Russians intensified their struggle to control Central Asia, and all European powers competed to control parts of China. By the early 20th century, most of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific had been divided among these empires, each of which justified its domination of other peoples in the name of bringing civilization to backward peoples who required instruction in Western values, government, Christianity, and labor practices. Territorial expansion had been a part of American life from the beginning, but the 1890s marked a major transformation of America's relationship to the rest of the world. Americans more and more saw their nation as an emerging world power. Until the 1890s, the expansion of the United States had been in North America, though ever since the Monroe Doctrine, many Americans had seen the Western Hemisphere as an American sphere of influence. Americans talked of acquiring Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and other territories, but the only territory acquired after the Civil War was Alaska, regarded by many as worthless. Most who looked overseas wanted to expand trade, not take new possessions. Many farmers and manufacturers believed that America's production could no longer be absorbed in domestic markets, and thought overproduction was causing recurrent economic crises. They wanted foreign customers for their products. Christian missionaries actively spread American influence overseas in the late 19th century. Groups like the Student Volunteer Movement for Foreign Missions believed it was their mission to prepare the world for Christ's second coming and enlighten the heathens abroad. A few late 19th century thinkers actively promoted American expansionism. Josiah Strong, a well-known Congregationalist clergyman, tried to update Manifest Destiny in his book Our Country from 1885. He argued that Anglo-Saxon Americans who had shown their ability for liberty and self-government in North America should spread their institutions and values to, quote, inferior races, end quote, overseas who, he suggested, would benefit American manufacturers by becoming new consumers of their goods. Naval officer Alfred T. Mann, in his writing The Influence of Sea Power Upon History from 1890, argued that no nation could prosper without a large merchant fleet engaged in international trade and a powerful navy to protect it, which required overseas bases. Mahan insisted that with the western frontier closed, Americans had to look overseas for opportunity. Mahan influenced James G. Blaine, President Benjamin Harrison's Secretary of State, who advocated the acquisition of Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba for naval bases. In 1893, American planters in Hawaii organized a rebellion there that overthrew the native Hawaiian government of Queen Liliuokalani. Though Harrison asked the Senate to pass a treaty of annexation, President Grover Cleveland withdrew it. In 1898, during the Spanish-American War, the United States annexed the Hawaiian Islands. The Depression that began in 1893 intensified Americans' belief that an aggressive foreign policy would create markets for manufactured goods. All of these factors contributed to America's emergence as a world power in the Spanish-American War of 1898. But the war's immediate cause was Cubans' long struggle for national independence from Spain. 10 years of guerrilla warfare began in 1868, and revolt resumed in 1895. Reports of Cuban civilians suffering in Spanish detention camps aroused outrage and sympathy in America. Cries for intervention increased after February 15, 1898, when an explosion, probably accidental, destroyed the USS Maine, an American battleship in Havana Harbor, killing 270 sailors. When Spain rejected American demands for a ceasefire and eventual Cuban independence, Congress approved President McKinley's request for a declaration of war, which was justified as a humanitarian intervention. Congress adopted the Teller Amendment, declaring that the United States had no intention of annexing or dominating Cuba. The war was brief and resulted in only a few hundred American casualties, what one official called a splendid little war. The war's most important battle actually happened in the Pacific Ocean, in Manila Bay in the Philippines, a Spanish colony where Admiral George Dewey defeated a Spanish fleet. The most publicized land battle of the war involved the assault on San Juan Hill, outside Santiago, Cuba, made by Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Roosevelt was pro-expansionist and believed war would unite the nation and its men, whose masculinity he thought had suffered in the economic crisis of the 1890s. Although Roosevelt organized the Rough Riders to be a cross-section of America, it excluded blacks, and Roosevelt neglected to mention that black troops had actually reached the top of San Juan Hill before his troops. But Roosevelt's exploits made him a national hero, and after being elected New York's governor that fall, he became McKinley's vice president in 1900. The war to liberate Cuba soon became an imperial mission that culminated in the creation of a small overseas American empire. McKinley would not return the Philippines to Spain or hand it over to the Filipinos who had fought for independence because he didn't believe that they could govern themselves. He also spoke of Americans' duty to uplift and civilize the Filipinos and train them to rule themselves. In the treaty ending the war, the United States acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Before McKinley recognized Cuba's independence, he forced that island's new government to approve the Platt Amendment to the new Cuban Constitution, which gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuba with its military whenever it saw fit. Cuban patriots were extremely disappointed by what they saw as America's betrayal, and such resentments helped inspire the revolution in Cuba 50 years later. Americans' interest in their new insular possessions had more to do with trade than with settlement or extracting resources, however, and they sought Cuba and Puerto Rico, and in the Pacific, the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii, as outposts for trade to Latin America and Asia. In 1899, Secretary of State John Hay declared the open door policy, demanding that the European powers that had divided China into commercial spheres of influence allow equal trade access to America. Western influence and presence in China soon led to the Boxer Rebellion, in which Christian Chinese and foreigners were targeted by Chinese nationalists, and American troops helped quell the uprising. While many Cubans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans had welcomed American intervention as a means to wrest independence from Spain, continued American control, direct and indirect, quickly alienated these patriots and others. After victory in the Philippines, Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the independence movement there, established a provisional government with a constitution modeled on that of America. When McKinley decided to retain possession of the islands, the Filipinos rebelled. A second, longer, and far more bloody war ensued, lasting from 1899 to 1903, costing the lives of more than 100,000 Filipinos and 4,200 Americans. The war was hotly debated in the United States, where reports of atrocities against Filipino civilians, including burning villages, torture, and rape and executions, seemed to damage America's image as a liberator. McKinley's administration justified the war as an effort to, quote, uplift and civilize and Christianize, end quote, the Filipinos. Most residents were already Catholics. The American colonial government, led by William Howard Taft, quickly modernized the islands with railroads, schools, public health officials, and modern agriculture. But American policies in its new possessions tended to favor land-based local elites, whether native-born or American, and usually created persistent poverty for the majority. American rule came with American racial attitudes. In an 1899 poem, the British writer Rudyard Kipling asked the United States to take up the white man's burden of imperialism. American supporters of empire felt that white domination of non-white peoples represented the progress of civilization. But America's new empire sparked an intense debate about the interrelationship of democracy, race, and American citizenship. America's governmental system had no provision for permanent colonies, and the right of every people to self-government was a key principle of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson's idea of America as an empire of liberty assumed that new territories would eventually be admitted as new states, and its residents would become American citizens. Yet after the Spanish-American War, nationalism, democracy, and American freedom seemed aligned with ideas of Anglo-Saxon supremacy. Both Democratic and Republican leaders who wanted to retain the new possession feared negative consequences of incorporating, quote, alien races, end quote, into America. The Foraker Act of 1900 declared Puerto Rico an insular territory, different from previous territories in the American West. Its 1 million inhabitants were defined as citizens of Puerto Rico, not the United States, and were denied a future path to statehood. Filipinos were given the same status. In a series of cases decided between 1901 and 1904, known as the Insular Cases, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution did not fully apply to overseas territories held by the United States, thus sharply limiting the extent of American freedom. Congress had to recognize the fundamental rights of these new peoples, but could otherwise govern them as it saw fit for an indefinite time. Hawaii became a traditional territory and was admitted as a state in 1959. The Philippines became independent in 1946. Although Congress gave American citizenship to Puerto Ricans in 1917, Puerto Rico has the status of a commonwealth, neither a state nor a territory, which has its own government, but lacks a voice in Congress and presidential elections. America's racial attitudes had a global impact in the age of imperialism. Global concerns about immigration, race relations, and the, quote, white man's burden, end quote, seemed to inspire solidarity among Anglo-Saxon nations. Chinese exclusion and segregation in the Jim Crow South influenced discriminatory laws in Canada, South Africa, and Australia. Other nations seemed to learn from Reconstruction's failure that multiracial democracy was impossible. America's new empire caused intense debate and controversy. Opponents formed the Anti-Imperialist League, which united writers and social reformers who wanted reforms at home, businessmen who thought overseas empire was too expensive, and racists who did not want non-whites brought within the United States. The League warned Americans that empire was incompatible with democracy and urged Americans to help Puerto Ricans and Filipinos gain their independence. In 1900, the Democrats once again nominated William Jennings Bryan to run against President McKinley, and the Democrats' platform opposed the Philippine War for militarily subjugating a foreign people demanding, quote, liberty and self-government, end quote. The president of the Anti-Imperialist League declared that the nation's most pressing question was whether the nation would be a republic or empire. Proponents of American empire embraced the language of freedom too. Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana argued that America sought abroad not material resources or national power, but desired only to bring freedom to other peoples. America practiced a benevolent imperialism that would uplift backward cultures and spread liberty. America, Beveridge argued, only went abroad for trade, not to rule other nations. McKinley, benefiting from economic recovery and a swell of American patriotism from winning the Spanish-American War, beat Bryan in 1900. At the start of the 20th century, America seemed ready to become a great power. Writers at home and abroad predicted that American influence would soon pervade the globe. In his book, The New Empire, Brooks Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams, predicted that America's economic might would make it outweigh any single empire, if not all empires combined. This would not happen until after World War II, but the characteristics that would constitute America's global strength were already present in 1900. The United States had already surpassed European competitors in industrial production. The merger movement of 1897 to 1904 left much of the economy controlled by corporations. Politics had stabilized, and the white North and South had reconciled, while hardened racial lines, segregation, Chinese exclusion, Indian reservations, limited the boundaries of citizenship and freedom. Yet questions central to 19th century debates over freedom, such as the relationship between economic and political liberty, the role of government in creating the social conditions for freedom, and the definition of citizenship and national identity, had not been answered definitively. They would continue to be central to American life in the 20th century. And with that, we'll conclude this lecture. Here's a preview of what to expect in Chapter 18 and the next lecture. And of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, or you can post your question to the coffee shop discussion board in Canvas to involve your peers in the discussion as well.